Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bullpen. He's back in the bullpen today. We got Mr. Christopher Barnard, commentator Young Voices. We're going to talk about the Ukraine-Russia conflict and how it impacts global energy. This individual has been here before, writes for a wide range of outlets, including National Review, The Hill, and USA Today. Mr. Barnard, thank you for being back on the show. How are you?
I'm good. Looking forward to a great discussion.
Absolutely. Okay. I don't want to presume what you know, believe about how this conflict has adversely impacted energy consumption and energy availability. So if you would, give us your thoughts and I will then opine.
Yeah, I think we're currently witnessing the importance of energy security.
Yeah.
And everyday Americans are feeling it at the pump with high energy prices and gas prices. And really, I think that what's happened in Europe and kind of the energy policy we've seen there over the last decade is a cautionary tale of what we shouldn't be doing. You have countries like Germany shutting down their nuclear plants, kneecapping the domestic natural gas industry. And instead of moving to clean energy, they just started relying on Russia to import fossil fuels. And that gave Vladimir Putin geopolitical leverage over the continent. And I believe that the United States or other democratic countries in the world should not be relying on authoritarian dictatorships to supply our energy needs. And I'm worried that right now, with the United States moving towards a clean energy transition, that we're going to be relying on countries like China to supply our solar panels, our critical minerals, and to really dominate us in that sense. And so I really believe that in the short term, yes, we should be looking at ways to increase oil and gas production to mitigate prices, but also we should be looking at ways that we can diversify our energy sources and get more clean energy, but without relying on countries like Russia and China.
You know, 75% of what you said sounds like a progressive, right? All right, 25% does not. So let me get to something I actually agree with you on. I think it is a security mistake, obviously, to have this level of dependence on energy with foreign entities, period, even if they were not dictatorships. The conversation of energy independence started in the 70s in America. And it was actually Republicans and Democrats talking the same talk. Now something happened. You know what happened, brother? Lobbying, special interest groups. They came into the field of politics and they started lobbying these politicians to where now conservatives by and large, and you are conservative, but you think independently on this issue, conservatives by and large, they don't see the value that you see in what you just said. And then you have corporate Democrats who are the same. They may talk a big game, but then they still vote in favor of these conglomerates that continue to keep us dependent on energy outside of the country. But let me go to the element of the Green New Deal, right? The vast majority of Americans actually agree with the Green New Deal. Every poll suggests the Green New Deal, based on its merits, is something agreeable to most Americans. Let's talk about the infrastructure. While we say, yes, energy independence is where we should get to, most people assume that means less dependency on foreign oil. Well, America has been getting that taken care of for years as far as our dependency on foreign oil, right? So that's not the full issue here. The full issue is not just the energy, but it's the infrastructure. And let me explain what I mean by that. I would like to get your thoughts on it. If we're looking for energy and infrastructure, that means we can't just have electrical ports for cars. We got to have more electrical cars for the ports. That's energy and infrastructure. And I think what we've talked about is one or the other rather than both. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you bring up a lot of really good points, and I'd love to be able to respond to all of them. But obviously, in the interest of time, you mentioned, for example, the importance of infrastructure and kind of building out this clean energy infrastructure in the United States, which I think is crucial. And actually, I'll also add that I don't really think that that's a conservative or a progressive position. I think that's just a commonsensical position, and that's why I'm pushing for it. But in terms of the infrastructure in this country, if you look at, for example, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is basically our regulatory structure for permitting these types of infrastructure projects, and if you look at the amount of red tape it requires to, for example, build a solar farm or a wind farm somewhere, it takes years and years and millions of dollars to get this approved. And I think that's just not helpful at all to what we're trying to achieve here. 45% of projects that are backlogged under this regulatory structure are clean energy projects. Only 15% are fossil fuel projects. And so I think we need to take a holistic look at government and find ways that Republicans and Democrats can work together. And one of those, I think, is regulatory reform to make it easier to build cleaner in the United States.
Let me opine on that. I 100% agree, and some people will be shocked by my proclamation, but let me give you some context to that. What we have in the clean energy space is the same dynamic we have in the fossil fuel space. Competition of major corporations. These major corporations, they do not want competition. It's adversarial to their business survivability. They don't want actual competition. So what they've been able to do, and this is a really great trick that corporations play and politicians sell. What they've been able to do is present a model that says we want severe regulation in these industries, which really is aimed to stop or significantly slow down competitors in that space, which by the way would draw down on some of the market consumer price if you had that competition. But they would like to see about 5 to 7 major companies have control of that industry. But it's the same thing as it relates to oil. It's the same thing as it relates to all other major industries in the United States and international industries as well. So I'm with you on regulation reform, but I'm not with Republicans when they say deregulate all markets. I think what happens typically, brother, is that we allow the extremes to argue against themselves, and it doesn't seem like it possesses much common sense. When you allow one extreme, which is let's completely deregulate, to argue with somebody who's 100% for all regulation, you never come to a consensus with that kind of argument. So I'm glad that you pointed it out, and I'm with you on the reform part. But the question, the devil is in the details, brother. At what point is it reform? And at what point is it just a free for all? What are your thoughts on that?
I think right now you're the one sounding like 75% conservative, 25% progressive.
When it comes to energy, brother, we have got to be energy dependent in this state, in this country. We have to figure out a way to do that and to stop tearing up our environment in the process. So I am for deregulation under that model.
Yeah, and like what you said about companies, big companies doing what big companies do. Yeah. They don't actually like competition. It's the same reason Amazon is trying to lobby for a $15 minimum wage, and why you have energy companies trying to entrench their own interests. And the sad thing is, it's not just for fossil fuel companies. You have the solar industry as well that is working on these, on trying to entrench their own interests and trying to, for example, ban tariffs or implement tariffs on other companies. And so you really kind of see where companies don't want this competition. Now, as a conservative, I do believe that competition is a good thing. And you look, for example, at the energy market in Texas, and it has its flaws, and there certainly can be reforms. But you look at the fact that Texas, if it were a country, would be the 5th largest producer of wind energy in the world. And that is, I think, because it has allowed for electricity competition and choice. And consumers tend to like wind and solar nowadays, including Republicans. And so a red state like Texas is building out the wind industry like nowhere else in the world. I think that's a pretty good thing.
All right, so let me highlight this. 5 states produce most of the oil in the US: Texas, North Dakota, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Alaska. I want to highlight something you said that I thought was interesting. And it's kind of a caveat point. You said Amazon lobbying for $15 an hour minimum wage. Now, I'm for increasing the minimum wage. I'm for $15 an hour if that makes sense regionally. Now, my approach is more nuanced because minimum wages don't translate to actual cost of living per region. I would like the cost of living calculation to be included in the increase of minimum wage. But do you at least agree, and as I said, a side point, but you brought it up, do you at least agree that we do need healthy regulation as it relates to how people get paid in America?
I mean, that's obviously not necessarily part of my daily work, and so I'm not necessarily qualified to answer that. I will say, I think you hit the nail on the head that a federal minimum wage doesn't really make sense because of those regional differences. I do share the opinion of many of kind of right-leaning economists that the effective minimum wage is $0 simply because the wages are set by the market, not by arbitrary policy. But again, I think we're digressing from the main
typically,
topic.
Now I got you. I understand that, and typically, just so I can respond to your point, those conservative economists have been debunked routinely, even by historical dynamics, dating back to the 40s, where we were always told by corporations, you cannot raise the minimum wage, it'll do A, B, and C to the market. And it never did. It actually gave more people money. There's a market adjustment. And after that market adjustment, they were able to continue to make their profits while individuals got paid more money. The truth is, without any regulation in that market, you then return to individuals making $4 or $5 an hour, which is a no-no in this country. And it's already set federally quite low anyway. And if minimum wage kept up with inflation in this country, minimum wage would be roughly $22 an hour right now, but we allowed that to get away from us. Okay, let's talk about the tech slate. What are your thoughts about tech slate and how this interplays with that?
About what did you say?
How does tech interplay with what's happening with Russia, Ukraine right now? Give us your thoughts on that. This is your field, and so you're
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think what we have seen in the last few years in the US, and I think this Ukraine crisis has only accelerated it, but we're seeing huge demand in the US for clean energy technologies. I mean, as I've said, there's trillions of dollars in private capital ready to pour into these investments. I think sometimes the regulatory situation is not really allowing that to be put to good use. And I think there's ways that we can really in this country work on allowing these clean energy technologies to compete and to allow the United States to become the world leader on this, so that we're not relying on countries like China. And one of the big worries that I have, in which maybe I believe your side of the aisle doesn't talk enough about, is, for example, for this whole clean energy transition, for electric vehicles, batteries, wind farms, and solar panels, you need critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, all those different critical minerals, which 90% of them we get from China right now. Now, what are we going to do about that? Do we have to source those at home? I believe we do. But a lot of progressive environmentalists are uncomfortable with that. And so I would say that there's a lot of things in the United States that need to change to allow the clean energy transition to really occur, and for the United States to become a world leader and become less reliant on China or Russia for our energy.
Yeah, you got to change the infrastructure. I agree with you. We have, way too much dependence on China for much of this stuff, metallic and non-metallic products. But once again, you don't get there by just, putting this piece and that piece together. You literally have to present an exhaustive plan that will take years to implement, that transform the infrastructure while at the same time transforming the energy itself. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And like you said, you need both electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. It's a yin and yang. You need both to be able to do this. Now, the one thing I will say is I believe that progressives tend to underestimate the amount of private capital that is interested in this. Last year, over 70% of new energy investments in the United States were in clean energy. There is huge demand for it. But if we have these supply chain bottlenecks and these regulatory gridlocks all over the country, we won't be able to build that out, and we can't let that capital invest in this. And I think we can both agree that we want trillions of dollars to go into clean energy. And I think that we can work with the private sector with sensible reform and sensible regulatory solutions.
That's the key word, brother. Sensible. Sensible reform.
I love sensible.
How do you define that in an era of extremism in politics, right? How do you define it when we're living in a political culture that has become more tribal than ever before? I don't think we've ever lived in such a tribal culture in politics. So we're talking about common sense solutions, remedies to problems that really should be nonpartisan. However, the extremes on both sides will kind of go to their corners and not argue in the middle for this stuff. But I'm with you that we got to stop significant dependence on foreign oil and countries for energy, et cetera. But once again, it's your guys on the right who are typically the ones fighting progressive reform as it relates to energy. I'm not saying that we're 100% all the way, we've solved this all the way, but I am saying that when you have presentations like the Green New Deal and the vast majority of Americans actually agree with it, and you don't have a Republican counterpart to that, that tells you something about the national conversation. And Republicans demonize the Green New Deal on a regular basis. And with all of that negative talk about the Green New Deal, it is still more popular than any Republican bill that has been presented of its kind.
I don't think you're wrong. And I think the right definitely needs to come up with an answer. And my organization, the American Conservation Coalition, we're working hard on trying to do that. And we're the young Republicans and the young conservatives pushing for that. One thing that you said, though, is interesting. One of the big things I believe that caused this crisis, this energy crisis in Europe, is because of Europe's really quite backward approach to nuclear energy. You had a country like Germany that got rid of its nuclear plants, and instead of kind of getting that energy elsewhere from clean energy domestically, they got it from fossil fuels from Russia. And I think a lot of the same problems are starting to happen in the United States as well. You have countries like states like California closing their nuclear plants. You have New York that closed its nuclear plant last year and emissions spiked 35%. Those are progressive legislatures voting for anti-clean energy legislation. I don't think that's a good thing, and I'm sure you don't think that's a good thing. And so really, I'm not interested in a blue team versus red team fight. I'm interested in sensible solutions, like I said. And so when progressives are talking about we need clean energy, they can't exclude nuclear from that equation. And that's where I think conservatives have been providing value to this conversation. We need to build out our nuclear industry in this country. We need to not rely on Russia to import uranium. And we need to allow innovation and technology, such as small modular reactors, to unfold to help us tackle climate change. And that is something that I believe conservatives and I'm trying to bring to the table as part of this conversation.
With that said, brother, we're out of time. We got another show to go to, but I got to say this to you. While I don't agree with everything you've said here, I don't have to. I'm glad that you're part of the movement. I'm glad that you're pointed in the right direction as far as environment and energy, even if I disagree with some of the nuance you present. But once again, you have a tough job ahead of you, young man, because you're inside of a party that typically has been purchased, has been bought by those who are adversarial to your sentiment. But big ups to you for even trying. I appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.